Welcome back to my computer screen, my friend.
Thank you very much. Always a pleasure to be on your computer screen.
Right on. No, I think I'm on yours. I like the
Yes,
feeling
that
of
too.
being on your screen. It's nice.
That might be something less of a pleasure being on my computer screen than being on yours.
It's still a little bit flat, but the illusion works.
It is still a little bit flat.
Yes.
It's just, yeah.
Well, speaking of flat, it's interesting because we were just you asked me how it's going. I've just helped my mom move from Atlanta, Georgia to Florida, and she's retiring, and she moved down to her brother and sister-in-law lived down here, never retired down here, and it's basically this what do you call it, senior citizens community, and I've never really spent time in Florida. And the senior citizen community is basically so. In other words, it's like kind of northern mid-state, and you can tell that there was like nothing here, and then a developer came, and they created a whole simulation of a place, and they put these boxes in a row, right? And they made the boxes look like houses, and then they put a senior citizen center, right? That well, each one of these like theme park things. I have to say, so someone I don't know who, maybe you know who this was. You can always tell when a civilization is going to collapse because of the first place it hits. So you see it in the elderly and in the children.
Mm.
It kind of works in from there. So I don't take that for what it's worth, but it's it's really something. Like they they have it's basically simulation, right? um they had there's a town that they built to be to basically, like, they built for it to look like it's from like 1800s, and it's like this whole town is constructed to look like a town center and all that kind of stuff, and then everyone drives golf carts, and it's like the place is just packed with golf carts and old people coming here to retire and golf, and you know like places to golf and places to do archery and all of this stuff.
It's like a resort.
Yeah, and I've been walking around, and I've just been thinking to myself, okay, this is where we go to die, and it I'm I'm perplexed. So
Mm.
so it's really got me thinking about some things, because when we think about what a senior citizen is, right, versus, or when we think about what we mean when we say elder, right? When someone's an elder, and then if someone is a senior citizen, I think they connotate very different things. There's nothing about this place, right, that says we've built this for elders. We've definitely built this for senior citizens, and I think you can hear it in a conversation I had with, and this is nothing personal, like with my aunt or uncle, or it's nothing personal. I'm actually like highlighting the possibilities that the culture, right, offers, that we end up walking into, right. That's more what I'm highlighting. But I, like, for example, I listened to my uncle talk about the God, 20 minutes about how he ate his morning Dunkin' Donut muffin, right? And he's like, "Oh yeah, it's like crumbly. Those things are so crumbly, but boy, they're good." So I got one, but then I figured it out, right? I turn it upside down. If I turn it upside down, then it just, my aunt starts going, "Well, in my muffin, for like 25 minutes, we talked about the functionality, right, of muffinhood."
The functionality of muffinhood.
I've noticed like in all the conversations I've peeked into is like everybody's talking about these logistical concerns, like as if they were the thing to talk about, right? And it struck me about it. I'm like, what is going on with that? Like, especially when you think about when you get older, right? I mean, historically, cultures have always understood that it's the elders that have the wisdom, right? And so you kind of take care of the elders, or they have some role, but they have a role where they don't have to worry about functioning as much, right? And they get to be wise, right? And here, it's interesting. It's like no one's expecting anyone to be wise, right? And they aren't, therefore, they aren't expecting to be wise, right? And because on one level, they're taken care of, but on another level, most of them only have like maybe one layer of family behind them, right? If at all. And therefore, even if they're kind of being helped out, they're constantly having to think about functioning because, as they lose capacities, right? Then all of a sudden, all of their attention is on this functionality. And I'm, I mean, it's funny, but there's something profoundly sad about it, right? It's profoundly sad about it. And I was thinking about like, and as I was sitting in order to kind of, maybe survive the conversation, let's say, I was sitting there thinking to myself, all right, what would this been if we go back in time, this conversation, right, at the kitchen table? What would have been different? And I kind of put myself back in, like, say, the Middle Ages, let's say, and I kind of got it. My understanding of something like the Middle Ages was, you had your family, and most likely we'd be sitting there with a lot more family around. We'd most likely be living in the same house or in the same, buildings or something like that. And then everything that we looked around at would have been made by someone, right? Probably someone that we knew. So I probably had objects that were made by your family before passed down. Probably be sitting in a chair like that probably has some story to it that's connected with somebody, and then there'd be more people. But then there'd be like the landowner who I would have some relationship with, right? And then there'd be like the clergy, let's say, right? The who I'd have some kind of relationship with. And then there'd be the church fathers, right? And then the church. And so if we had that conversation on some level, when my uncle would speak, there would be this background of multiple layers, right, of mattering on some level. And I kind of got that sense of this anxiety that was really kind of running through, like this kind of constant sense of alert worriness that brings your attention just to the most basics of functioning. And I had this sense because I looked around at, my uncle and my aunt, and I was like, oh, there's only one layer of family behind them. In terms of the land that we're living on, the owner is probably some CEO to some company that maybe has never even been here. And then everyone around them are elderly in the same position. And so there's like, I just got this sense it's like on the level of protection, right? There's nothing behind them, or very little behind them. Or I would say even on a deeper level, there in terms of mattering, right? Levels of mattering, right? Of the consequences of my speaking and people being concerned about me and me in their realms of concerns. And so I really got this sense of like, it's really weird to think about that, like growing old and you have the life that you have, no matter how profound or significant you are. And then you end up here, basically optimized, a place optimized for somebody's profit, right? And you're being kept entertained with these games and all of this stuff that are really with people you probably don't have much history with and who are in the same boat as you. Yet the conversation there's no conversation around here that it all speaks mortality or death. It almost speaks something else, right? But everyone knows we're old and we're going to die. But it's spoken in the unsaid. It's spoken in the banality of these rows of houses and these kind of fake lawns. And so I've been it's just it's as a as being Guy, thinking about things all the time, as I have a tendency to do. That's been on my mind. Hang on one second. Let me adjust the
Yeah, I
blinds here.
can't see you very well anymore.
Yeah. Classic. I like got the light all correct and right when I was in here. My mom walks in and closes the blinds. It's like my childhood all played all over again.
So is this where you are right now?
Yeah.
Everything you've just described to me, you're not describing it from a distance. You're describing it from within at this moment. It just occurs to me. This is where you are at the moment. You're in Florida.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
Interesting.
I talked. I had a pretty good long talk with John yesterday. It was really great. Connecting with him again. And I like what in my estimation, right? I think this says a lot of things, right? But one of the things it for sure says is that because we don't have a sense of wisdom, we don't have a sense of needing wisdom. Therefore, we can't see it and we can't relate to it, right? Therefore, when someone gets old, they're a citizen. A senior citizen basically means a citizen like you and us, just diminished. Versus when you can kind of get like perceive wisdom and understand wisdom, like you see an elder, right, who's can make some beyond like transrational perceptions and choices based on things that you could only know through having experienced it over and over again over a lifetime. No one's asking them those questions. They're not expecting anyone to ask them, right? If anything, they feel like a burden to their kids, right? And guilt around that or obligated or whatever that is. But there is no expectation that the life that you had lived is of great value to anybody. And so I think on one level, it has to do with that we don't notice that we don't understand or even therefore see something like wisdom. It's lost. And I was thinking about this too, like in if you go to the other end, right? Because we say that like if we look at culture, right, the breakdown of an empire, right, shows up in the end of life and the beginning of life, the children. And I think about like children, at least here in America, like the public school system, it's become all about preparing for these tests at the end of the year. In fact, as far as I can tell, the grades, the grades are less and less significant. And what's more important is that like school is to be able to take these tests at the end of the year, which will make all kinds of predictions about where you can go. So it's like even there, I think there's a way in which, whereas in old age, the elderly have become optimized, right, to extract money from in these centers, all right, and keeping them entertained on some level, right, having had just lived. And like children are also seen as kind of a standing reserve, measuring their abilities or their intelligence or whatever it is, and to get the most out of their capacities, right? This sense of being able to the sense for a deeper conversation about wisdom, right? A deeper perception about seeing life itself as an end in itself, right? Worthy of cultivating, right? Without not everything having to be immediately useful, right? I think it's so lost. And it's funny when I get that, as I see that more and more and more, I understand that more. I'm just seeing it in more and more places. And even down into, my mom was telling me my uncle collected toy trains, right? His whole life. He had this like amazing train collection, you know, the little, where you set up the little villages and all that stuff. And he just had like hundreds and hundreds of these planes, like one of the biggest collections in the world. And then he went to go sell them, and they weren't worth anything because no one does that anymore. And then she was telling me about my grandfather who had collected coins all his life. Right, he had just a whole basement full of like old coins. She said, yeah, when he died, and we went to go sell them, they weren't worth anything because nobody collects those things anymore. And I was thinking about like, yeah, I haven't even heard that word hobby. I never really liked that word anyways, but this sense in which this idleness, right? I like this sense of idling in the deeper sense of the word, of that I'm doing something as an end in itself, right? Like collecting and those kinds of things. That's going down as well. So that's how I'm doing.
So you're there now, and how do you find, so in a space that's clearly been designed as a kind of indefinite vacation, a kind of recreational center by the sounds of it. That's why just the analogy to the resort keeps coming to me, right? A place that's designed to distract and divert. When you, as someone for whom the space is not intended and not designed, when you find yourself there, you know, when you're not sitting down spending time with your mom, when there isn't a very clear and directed activity for you to lose yourself in, how do you find yourself comporting in that space? What do you do? Right? So like if you're there during the day, let's say for whatever reason you're not with your mom at any given moment in time, how is Guy spending his time in this place that is not intended for him?
Thinking about this, like literally like walking around, looking at things, and just letting myself just see it, right? And see more of it and think about it. And I think I think on a larger scale for me, I think one of the ways to respond to this, right? And I find myself doing this a lot. In fact, in responding in this way, there's an ecstaticness of there's some kind of, even though the news is really bad, there is an ecstasis in the truthness being revealed, right? That sense of truth feels like, I feel like if I didn't have that, I would just be irritable and powerless and cynical. I don't feel that way. And so there's a sense of where maybe perhaps the most authentic way to be is to really be with what is. And if and I was thinking about what Heidegger talks about, like, well, you know, our epoch is the time where the being of being, the sense of the wholeness, right? That the logos gathers together, right? That sense of things is disappearing, right? Nihilism. To be with being is to be with its disappearance. It's like that's the way being is present, is in its absence, is in its nullness, in these places, right? And turning towards it and like really attempting to reveal it. There's something rich there for me. Yeah. And then
that's right. That's interesting.
My mom and my family, which is just, they're great people. Like they're awesome. I'm enjoying getting closer to them.
It's interesting that the very thing, for lack of a better word, that is excluded from the givenness of the world becomes present precisely in the margins right, of its exclusion. And I can picture you walking around in that sort of makeshift reality, seeing precisely all that is not there,
Yeah.
and becoming more conversant with the presence of what is absent precisely for its absence. Because that is really when it becomes more salient, isn't it? When its absence becomes so perceptible that suddenly what was given is no longer given. And when that happens, suddenly it's revealed.
Yes. Right.
And so wandering the lack thereof
Mhm.
is precisely the way of communing with it, right? Like that's what I'm feeling when I listen to you. Sort of, I can picture you walking around there, looking at the edifice of this, this resort, and I can picture you seeing precisely all that is absent from it and walking with it, despite the fact that it is nowhere to be found, perhaps to anyone else.
Yeah.
And in a way, because I have that experience too when I'm in, and whether it's in structure or in company, when I'm in a context that lacks the very thing that otherwise provides vitality. In a way, I feel more intimate with that vitality
Mhm.
because of how noticeably absent it might be from a given place. It's almost like a reversal of the loneliness. Because I was thinking about this a lot, recently in the context of loneliness, and why a lot of people often say that they feel far more lonely in company, or certain kinds of people, at least people who list on the introverted side, I suppose, often feel more lonely with company than without. And oftentimes I'm one of those people, right? Depending on the company. And I think in some ways it's because, when absence is appreciable,
Mhm.
it becomes meaningful.
And
But when it's not,
it becomes meaningful. Mhm.
but I think when it's not, it's much harder, right? If you feel that you are within range of what should be apparent, of what should be meaningful, but it isn't,
Oh,
that to me is the lonely feeling.
yeah.
But when it is accounted for in its absence, to me, it's a lot less lonely. So, for instance, when you're in a group of people and you're very decidedly an outsider to that group of people, it's like that you're on the opacity side of the transparency opacity spectrum, right? You're looking at this as though you're watching a tableau from an audience. You're watching something play out, but you feel very detached from it. That becomes a very meaningful experience insofar as things become observable to you that just never would have been. And to me, that's far from being a lonely experience. In fact, that when it's a very decisive, very kind of intelligible dissociation, and when it's one that's kind of accounted for by the circumstances, that detachment can afford a kind of inquiry that is extremely, extremely valuable and meaningful. And that's kind of what I'm hearing from you while you're there, being so on the outside of the givenness of that world.
Yeah.
You can read it so much more closely than if you were really ensconced within it. And there's something so freeing, contemplatively freeing about that experience, right? Just like being in a group of people who are all maybe absorbed in a chattering conversation that maybe you have no interest in
Yeah.
participating, but as an observer,
Yes.
it becomes an incredibly meaningful experience, because suddenly you can see the silhouette of that dialogue, and you can see precisely what it contains and what it excludes and the difference therein. And so that, yeah, I can understand, I think, why, despite how saddening it is, and maybe even tragic it is,
Mhm.
there's also a great deal of abundance to it, paradoxically, to that experience.
Yeah, yeah. I really like I like that turn that you did, because it brought it into relief more. That sense of like, well, the opposite of that would be something like where there is something that is attractive or that I want to be a part of, and somehow I don't feel I have access to it. Right? There
Right.
is that kind of. I mean, I think everyone knows what that feeling is like, right?
Yeah, that's distressing.
Right? And either your mood doesn't predispose you to be involved in it, or that you're legitimately like left out. You can't find your way in. That's a very different sense. And so, I've been thinking about this because I encounter a lot of people who are like us thinking about this, right? Interested in this sense of whatever's happening about around this time in this way. And there's a way in which one can easily become on some sense identified with it, hopeless, right? Like, depressed, consumed in some sense by the nullity of the age that they're in. And I've often wondered about what is right. Well, what is just from a sense of one's own personal happiness, right? In a time of like so we'll say the apocalypse that's coming or something, right? Like if this in fact is a time where the West is in decline, let's say, right, and the loss of spirituality and the emergence of nihilism. Does somebody does somebody have to have a bad mood, be in a bad mood because of it, right? Like, what is a way one can be with that that's on one really aware of it, right? Looking right at it, and at the same time still be enlivened, right, by the way that you're being with all of it, right? Because I've often thought about it. I don't know if it's on a personal level. If I'm miserable in a miserable time, right? Doesn't necessarily. I'm not sure if that necessarily discloses that I'm in touch with the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Although I can very easily like name it as that time. Well, I'm like depressed because the apocalypse is coming. See,
Yeah.
like we talk about this, I just start to get brighter.
You're suddenly filled with angelic light. That must be a sign, Guy.
Liking the old folks home, right?
Moving through the mass until it is luminous. There's a quote like that from Plotinus. This light streams into the mass, lights it from all sides, and thus was guysengstock suffused with the light of the good. That's usually true anyway, my friend. It's just not always
right.
analogized by the actual light. Yeah. That's a very, very, boy, what a pregnant question I think that is. And intuitively, without any kind of qualification, it certainly seems to me that having your mood, I think that sometimes there is a false equivalency made between the trait of a particular humor, right? A depressive or let's say a melancholic humor, with a time of tragedy, or a time when the implicit tragedy of life is made more pronounced, like right now, that there can sometimes be a false identity claim between an individual bout of depressive, a depressive humor, and that kind of the macrocosmic state of things, and I think that's often confused. And I mean, we often talk about how ecstatic and leavening revelation is unto itself. Even if the revelation is the revelation of tragedy and suffering, the revelation thereof can often be an ecstatic experience. And I know for me can be incredibly arousing and lenative insofar as it can actually relieve certain pains, right? Just, I mean, the diagnosis relieves a great deal of anxiety, right? Precisely because
Right.
it's diagnosis.
Yeah.
And I mean, something as fundamental as the recollection of tragedy as the implicit truth of life, right? That axiomatic insight, right, which is so central to so many of the canonical wisdom traditions, right? Buddhism maybe most explicitly, but could certainly make the argument for Christianity too, right?
Yeah.
A tradition whose symbol is a crucifix, right, is premised on the realization of suffering as a prima materia, right, of life. And I know for me, you know, it's a again, for lack of a better word, it's a fact, or it's a condition of life that we do a great, just like what you've just described, we do a great deal to try and disabuse ourselves of that memory. But I find that when that memory resurfaces, sometimes precisely because it brings a great deal of lucidity and perspective to any given problem or situation, I find that memory is often rousing. I find the memory is often emboldening and encouraging rather than deflating, right? The recollection of the sort of the recollection that state, that condition is the first condition, not an incidental condition. It is the first condition. And everything else presupposes it. And we spend so much effort and time trying desperately to forget that everything else presupposes the implicit tragedy and suffering that is the natural state. Not to be, not to get all, Hobbesian about it, but you know what I mean? It's like, that's what we're working with fundamentally. And for me, the memory of that condition as a condition is something I find, oddly enough, restorative.
Right. I was just thinking about like the whole second half of Being in Time. Heidegger breaks down authenticity as a being toward death, right? And I get from that is this sense in which you turn toward, right, the impossibility of possibility, right, which is what we call death, right? And when you turn towards that in an authentic way, this sense of I don't, as he calls it resoluteness, right? And later he talked about it in more like Gelassenheit, right? What that affords is the particular start to shine through, right? The impermanence of the things and the profundity of somehow the moreness, within things shines through, and you can start to respond to it accordingly, right? Without, being overly attached and keeping things and all the things that comes with, being neurotic, which I'm very familiar with, right? Like, yeah, you're right. There is, and it's funny because I am seeing this, as a contrast to this, being with my mom, who I'm really proud of, like in this move, right? Everything from the move, right? But the symbol that this move is for her, because she had married someone when I was, let's see, they got married when I think it was in my early 20s. And so they were married, I don't know, over 20 years. And he had died about 18 months ago. And she moved to Atlanta to be with him. So she kind of came to this place where she realized, you know, the very reason for my existence down here is with him, right? And so she kind of got to this place where, well, not just of her own accord, but like with a lot of introspection, to be able to come to a place of recognizing and choosing to leave it, right? Was doing two things. It's like it was a genuine being ready and strong enough to say goodbye to what was authentically and to move towards a new life. And so what's interesting about this is I feel, we've been talking a lot, right? And since we've been down here, and I just get this sense of brevity from her. Like, like she sees all this stuff too, right? So she'll probably watch this video, as a matter of fact, and probably laugh her ass off, right? About what we're talking about. Like, there is something in her that feels very wise to me, right? And it has something, it has this transcendent, this sense of transcendence. Like there's a knowingness about, it's something like this. It's something like she'll laugh at something, right? Or we'll give each other a look about something. It'll just be a knowing sense of something's funny. And there's, in that laugh, there's the disclosure of something like, oh yeah, like they think that's so important, right? Oh, like the folly, right? The folly of of whatever the character neurosis that we're looking at, or the circumstances or something like that. There's a kind of laughter that happens that feels like wisdom. It feels like I'm drinking in her wisdom, in her sense of transcendence, right? And
As
she,
you're as you're yeah.
she's talk about somebody who's been through tragedy, like, and she had a super proud of her. She had a, and and when this happened, when John died, one of the things that she keeps saying is she's like, she says, I have no idea. I had no idea I was this strong. And I asked her, well, what's the source of the strength? She's like, I don't know. But I wouldn't have thought that I was strong enough to get through that. Here I am. I'm like flipping along. And it was a genuine sense that she really didn't know. And that there's something about even that sense of strength that she's somehow aware of, that she's not completely transparent to herself, and she's never going to be. And actually, there's something about it that's innate and almost maybe even good, right? And there's an acceptance, a deep acceptance of that, I think, in her being, that has the folly of watching other people try to struggle to pretend that they're completely self-transparent or something, right?
Right.
Knowingness,
right.
that's predisposed, right? Precisely through walking through tragedy. So that being said, I notice I'm not worried about her down here. I think she's gonna have a blast. She's gonna like she'll suck the marrow up. She'll they won't profit from her.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Is your mom, in any explicit or implicit sense of the term, is she religious at all?
She grew up Lutheran. Yeah, I think my grandfather took her to church pretty much every week. She didn't do that. She didn't do that with me. But she's also, she got into recovery when I was 12. Both my parents did. And so her and my mom were really involved in like 12 step. So she's very, she was more religious when she was a kid, at least around a lot more religion. And she's become, and she would say, a lot more spiritual, right?
Right. it occurs to me to ask, and you and I have talked about this before, that sometimes that even if it's completely implicit and intuitive rather than formalized, there is a certain kind of humility that comes with the the authentically religious disposition that I think does help people, and precise maybe even more at that stage in life. I don't know, won't presume it, but that does help to socialize the realization that one's life is not one's own. You and I have talked about this before, right? The realization that, like, not being transparent to yourself, not being not having the propriety over yourself and your own life that most of us presume to have at any given point in time. And someone who's willing to loosen the restraints a little bit, to relax that presumption a little bit, also allows herself to be surprised,
Yeah.
allows herself to be a revelation to herself in a way that sometimes people will just not allow, not permit, not fathom, right? The idea that even at the later stage of life, the idea that you can still not treat yourself as a fait accompli. I think that there's a certain wisdom in that humility, and as funny as you're talking about your mom, I think it's remarkably, the correspondence is actually quite remarkable. I think of my grandmother, who's been through a very similar transition in life recently. She's in her late 80s. Miraculously, she's still strong and full of vitality and very self-sufficient. I truly don't know how, but she's quite remarkable. And she's recently made this transition also to a retirement, after, leaving a house where she lived for decades, and that was like a treasure house of memory. It basically housed the memory of the family and the genealogy of the family. And that loss is something I mourned more than she appeared to mourn it. She was remarkably not at all very, at least outwardly, not at all very precious about that loss. I think that it was a greater loss to the rest of us, it would seem, than it was to her. But the humility that you're describing of your mom is kind of that just sort of that equilibrated perspective that is both, cannot help but be a little burdened, obviously, by the past, but is ultimately looking, is like Jung has this analogy about, the temporal horizon shift when the sun begins its downward journey to the horizon in the second half of life. And he talks about sort of the attitude of chasing the sun beneath the horizon and chasing it with a kind of renewed vitality, chasing it as though you're chasing it through to destination, keeping the momentum going past the finish line, as it were, right? Having that kind of, and I sense that in her, and I sense that that's part of what you're describing too, is that it's not again, at least outwardly, the interior life of a person is so hard to know, even if, and especially if it's somebody that you love. But it would seem to me that she's chasing the sun down into the horizon.
Yeah.
And there are few things in my mind that are more impressive than that. Truly. Truly.
It's funny, if the wisdom has something to do with a recognition that I am somehow, I can't account for myself. I can't own myself or have title to it, right? If that becomes, if all of a sudden you start to realize, like, oh, I am not as self-possessed as I thought. I don't own myself. I'm not property that I just get to own in some level. There's a brevity a lightness that seems
Yes.
to that predisposes one to, right? Because it's like all of a sudden I got that sense when you were talking about your grandmother, and this was the case with my grandfather, and I'm noticing it with my mom. There is a there's this sense just like look, at this point, like the fact I'm still breathing, it's just I don't know how I did that, right? There's a
Yeah.
there's something it's interesting. There's something not at stake that has never been at stake, but a recognition of, like, for example, she can't lose if you don't own your house, you can't, right? If you don't own the title, you can't lose it,
Exactly.
right? And so there's some sense in which
Exactly.
I think I would imagine the revelation of that I don't know where the title is, right? Maybe no one has it, but I don't have it. It seems like just in the fact of recognizing that I had thought I had it the whole time, but I never really even had it, seems to be access to this brevity that just finds oneself going for it. Because in some sense, there never was anything to lose.
That's right. Because it's not a thing that can be possessed or dispossessed.
Yeah.
Right. Once we get over the modally confused frame of it being an object to possess,
Absolutely.
then all of a sudden we're in a territory that's now it's uncharted by that frame precisely because it's beyond it. And
Right.
it's like the way that we think of our souls, as it were, right? If it is not something owned, then it is not something that can be lost. And if its propriety is shared and distributed between the very, very limited ego and the the unchartable transcendent, then ultimately then it becomes about the economy of responsibility. It's not eschewing responsibility, but it's understanding where the responsibility begins and where it ends and confers itself unto unto the supernal aspect, right? Where it can no longer be accounted for. It can no longer be be reeled in anymore. And I think that people who've reached that point, and I trust perhaps you don't have to be, in the twilight of your life to reach that point, but those who have seem to, in a way, you're right. The being, not unbearably, but bearably, the being is a lightness to it.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm gonna turn on some more lights here. The lights being
Yes. Yeah. Good idea.
other for 1 second.
All right.
That was a awesome pause that we just got.
It sure was.
I love pausing with you.
Let us unpause. Let us unpause.
So we're gonna start on page 22. I think we actually read ahead of this a bit, but it'd be good just to backtrack, just to get our feet going again and again. So this is some context on the way to language. This is a dialogue. I think it's supposed to be between a Japanese student whose professor was a student of Heidegger's. And Heidegger. So basically the dialogue is basically, they're talking about, essentially they're talking about language and a lot of these differences of trying to parse out on some set, or let happen these key terms that almost seem untranslatable in the other language. And so they've been circling around this almost impossibility in some sense of language. And as they're circling around it, you can get this sense that the dialogue itself starts to gather and dispose itself into like a different dimension almost, right? That's what I got so far.
Yep.
Okay, so
That's well said.
how about
So which
Jay?
you'll be Jay?
Yeah, I'll be Jay. So why don't you
Okay.
start? So page 22. So I think Jay,
Page 22.
you're the Japanese, and I'm Heidegger, I think.
Okay.
Here we go.
And just now you mentioned the phrase house of being, which would suggest the essence of language.
Thus, we have indeed stayed on the path of the dialogue.
Probably only because we, without quite knowing it, were obedient to what alone, according to your words, allows a dialogue to succeed.
It is that undefined something.
Which we leave in unimpaired possession of the voice of its promptings. Oh, what a great line.
Yeah, listen to part of this. It's that undefined something which we leave in unimpaired possession of the voice of its prompting. This is great because it's that John and I thought that the next four-way of getting the band back together, right, with Jordan and yourself and John, is about dialogue. This sense of how dialogue, the difference between dialogos happening in, say, narrative, and the dialogos happening in emptiness, and what the inquiry into that. So this really speaks to that.
Oh, I like that. I like that as a theme.
Yeah.
Let's
Yes.
Okay, let's keep that on the docket. I wholeheartedly endorse that.
Yeah. Okay, so we'll go ahead. So am I or you? Let's see.
I've been I so far.
Okay, got it. So I'm Jay. Of the same. Oh, I'm sorry.
Nope.
Yeah.
The previous.
Okay, cool. At risk that this voice, in our case, is silence itself.
What are you thinking of now?
Of the same as you have in mind, of the nature of language.
That is what is defining our dialogue. But even so, we must not touch it.
Surely not. If by touching you mean grasping it in the sense of your European conceptualizations.
No, those conceptualizations are not what I have in mind. Even the phrase house of being does not provide a concept of the nature of language, to the great sorrow of the philosophers who, in their disgruntlement, see in such phrases no more than a decay of thinking.
I, too, find much food for thought in your phrase, house of being, but on a different grounds. I feel that it touches upon the nature of language without doing it injury. For if it is necessary to leave the defining something in full possession of its voice, this does in no way mean that our thinking should not pursue the nature of language. Only the manner in which the attempt is made is decisive. So that part right there, like he's making this distinction basically between content and process, right?
Mm-hmm.
That the thing that may be the most mattering is the way of the unfolding itself, right? That if that's right on some sense, or if that's attuned on some sense, perhaps this enigmatic thing could actually, this undefinable something, right, can maybe blossom. But it's in somehow the sense of the process of the dialogue itself, right? I think is what's being
Right.
highlighted here.
Right. So only in the manner of pursuit does the thing being pursued become meaningful.
Yeah, the manner.
The meaningfulness of the pursued is dependent upon the meaningfulness of the manner of pursuit.
Yeah.
Right.
That last part again, the meaningful, the pursuit.
The meaningfulness of the pursued, that which we're pursuing,
Yeah.
its meaningfulness is dependent upon the manner of the pursuit.
Okay,
right? I think in a way that I think that's exactly in a way. It's exactly what you just said, just in different words.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So on some level, so in the dialogue, there's a couple of other dialogues that are going on. There's like the dialogue with the manner and the meaning, right?
Yes.
In the dialogue itself, that those two things are held, right? Because I think this is really just to tease this out, because I think this is probably precisely the opposite of what would happen in a, let's say, a normal dialogue or in an idle talk or at the dinner table or whatever, right? Of that, if anything, if the content is understood or listened to or wanted, if that by miracle somebody's listening or paying attention, right?
Yep.
Most definitely, very rarely is the manner of the pursuit of the conversation at all distinguished, seen, or addressed. Except
that's right. It remains. That's right. It remains transparent.
Yeah. Yeah.
It remains wholly transparent, so that the thing that distinguishes this dialogue, or what we've been calling dialogos, is that the content always refers back to the form.
Right.
That there is so that there's a dialogue between form and content that actually constitutes the structure of the dialogue.
Yeah.
Right. So that the dialogue between Guy and Christopher about the content is really a vessel for a dialogue on another axis, which is the dialogue between the form of dialogue and the content that is treated by it.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah. And so there's like, so then the form is not, in this manner of dialogue, it's not wholly transparent. But of course, neither is it wholly opaque either, because the content is still ultimately being treated.
Right.
Right. If the content was not being treated, you could see that the form was completely opaque because it was the sole focus.
Right.
The form is not the sole focus. Neither is the content the sole focus, right? The content is a medium for the form, and vice versa. So there's a kind of codependency between the two, that equilibrates the dialogue and keeps it evolving. It's also precisely the thing that keeps the dialogue not static, right?
So as you're talking about it, I noticed, like, in holding all the things that you are saying, there is kind of, there's some kind of transcendence that I need to do. There's like a widening where on some level I need to have my finger, but not too heavily on either of them, because it needs to become transparent for it to work, right? If I'm too much thinking about it, right? So he's not talking about, like, they're not saying, pay attention to this, pay attention to that, but it's the manner in which maybe it's held, right? There's a delicacy or something that seems to evoke a different quality of consciousness.
It
seems.
Yes.
Especially if you're going to chew gum at the same time. Shall we go on?
Yes. I think no. No, those conceptualizations are not what I have in mind. Oh, sorry. I read that already.
Oh, maybe.
Okay, sorry. I'm at the bottom of the page now.
Yeah.
That's right. Only the manner in which the attempt is made is decisive. That one line is what unfolded that little sojourn we just made. Okay. And so I now take courage to ask a question which has long troubled me, and which your visit now almost compels me to ask.
Do not count too heavily on my powers to follow your question. Our dialogue, meanwhile, has anyhow made me much more aware of how unthought everything still is that concerns the nature of language.
And especially since the nature of language remains something altogether different for the East Asian and the European peoples.
And what you call nature also remains different. How, then, could our reflection get out into the open?
Most easily, if from the very outset we do not demand too much. Thus, I shall permit myself for the moment to put to you an altogether preliminary question.
I fear that even this question can hardly be answered unless we disregard the danger of our dialogue. So just think
And
this
still the question's unasked.
right. So I think, is this, would you say, Chris, is this carefulness, right? Is that
Yes, it definitely is that.
Yeah.
At least that.
right? That carefulness. If we look at if you read this whole thing as also reading the manner in which this dialogue is happening, right? That carefulness.
Yeah. Yeah. They're trying to, it's like, they're trying to furnish the world in which the question is going to live, right? It's a very Socratic thing to do. And they're trying to take care to furnish it in such a way that the question, when it enters the world, will be able to live comfortably within the world, or perhaps not altogether comfortably, right? So they're trying to set the conditions that the question is going to sort of like the question will become the fulcrum. It'll become the center of a cosmos. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to fit, figure, and furnish the cosmos so that it can cede the focus to the central question, but also be prepared to expand it. It's the habitus for the question that they're trying to gather together, right? It's like they're trying to make a nest so that when they place this delicate egg into the nest, it actually is going to be able to hatch and fly, right? So they're nesting dialogue, I think, is what they're doing by doing this, right? And I catch myself in other contexts doing very much the same thing. I'm sure you do too, right? When you know you're about, whether personally or impersonally, when you're about to introduce something that's going to be volatile, philosophically volatile or emotionally volatile, whatever the nature of the volatility, when you're introducing a question that's going to be volatile, you want to make sure that you're it's like you have to enculturate the setting into which it's going to grow. And if you don't do that properly, or sometimes the feeling is when you don't do that properly, then really you're going to set it up to fail. And so I think that's part of the reason for the carefulness, is they're trying to tune the settings so that when they introduce this new melody, that it's not simply engulfed, and it doesn't simply dominate, but that it cohabitates in the conversation in such a way that allows it to grow properly.
Right.
Anyway,
sorry, that was interesting play here between, like, in some sense, they're furnishing the possibility of addressing and bringing this in. But one of the reasons why they're so careful about it seems, is because how little an awareness of on one level, how important it is, but like how much they don't know.
Yeah, exactly. They don't know what it's going to become.
For what's something they profoundly understand that they don't know. So how does one furnish, right, a environment or a world for something that you clearly, respectfully don't know about, right? On some level. That's really interesting in itself. Just Well, that's kind of part of the thing that we're in dialogos. It's precisely that's the kind of thing. That's yeah. I'm starting to hear the logos in this,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Especially that sense in which is that fragment that I talked about in my chapter, the do not listen to me, right? Instead, gather yourself in the gathering itself, right? Right? And in fitting knowledge, one atones all, right? This sense
That is the most Heideggerian twist of Heraclitus I've ever heard.
right. So interesting.
Yeah, because it's like you want the form, you want to, you want to, you want to socialize the form so that it can cede its territory to the content, but not also be overwhelmed by the content and dissolve altogether, right? So you want the form to be flexible, elastic enough that it's going to be able to morph itself around the gathering content of the dialogue. But you also don't want the form to dissolve, because if the form dissolves altogether, then all of a sudden there is nothing to gather anymore, because that which is gathered has to actually be gathered within a container that is elastic enough to allow the gathering to evolve and to grow, but that is substantial enough not to loose the content and have it scatter and become dissolute. Right. So that it has to be, again, it's that it has to be able to expand, but also to contract back.
Yeah. Right. So interesting when, especially when they're basically saying, what happens if we prepare the house language itself, right? We're both preparing the house and furnishing the house for the category of house to be housed in the content of housing, right? This is
yes.
Dyslexia loves this.
Yeah, you deal with that very, very admirably, I have to say. Like you wade right in there, you soldier through, and you do it very well. And I think it's it's very impressive. It's very impressive.
I've never been
compliments to you, my friend. Well, it's not. I mean, it's for people like me who don't experience it. It's a very easy thing to forget and to ignore, because it's just not, like, to me, it's not a salient detail, and I have to sometimes remind myself, or have you remind me. And as soon as I become aware again that you're like the sort of the default conditions through which you're interacting with this are so different, that immediately becomes an interesting detail, and an admirable one, considering how boldly you venture into it. So
you're right on. Thank you. Okay, so
where did we leave?
Where were we here? Most easily from the very outset, we do demand.
Yes. So I just finished saying, thus I shall permit myself for the moment to put to you an altogether preliminary question. We're about halfway down.
Yeah.
Or sorry, less than halfway down.
I tell you what, let's just start right here. And in what you call nature also remains different. How then could our reflection get out into the open?
Most easily, if from the very outset we do not demand too much. Thus, I shall permit myself for the moment to put to you an altogether preliminary question.
I fear that even this question can hardly be answered unless we disregard the danger of our dialogue.
That cannot be, since we are walking toward the danger.
Then ask away. After all that.
After all that,
Right.
after all that, there's this implicit agreement. Okay, at this point, we've
Right.
prefigured the conversational world enough that when we throw this into it, it probably,
Yes.
certainly, but probably won't implode and
Right.
devour us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The ancient Greek name for that is fuck it.
Yes. Fuck it.
Yes.
Exactly.
And ask away.
Okay. Then ask away. Okay. What does the Japanese world understand by language? Asked still more cautiously, do you have in your language a word for what we call language? If not, how do you experience what with us is called language?
No one has ever asked me that question before. And it seems to me also that we in our own Japanese world pay no heed to what you are asking me now. I must beg you then to allow me a few moments of reflection. There's a question.
Okay, so this makes me giddy because philosophical dialogues never have stage directions. And so when there's actually a stage direction in a philosophical dialogue, that's
Right.
I think that's music. I love it. I love it. So the stage direction is the Japanese closes his eyes, lowers his head, and sinks into a long reflection. The inquirer waits until his guest resumes the conversation. Okay, so you sink into your reflection now, Guy, and I'll wait.
Okay. There is a Japanese word that says the essential being of language, rather than being of use as a name for speaking and for language.
The matter itself requires that, because the essential being of language cannot be anything linguistic. The same holds true for the phrase house of being.
From a great distance, I sense a kinship between our word that is now before my mind and your phrase.
The phrase gives a hint of the nature of language.
It seems to me that you have just said a freeing word.
Then that hint would be the word's basic character. Oh, okay. Let's pause there.
Okay.
Let's pause there. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So, a freeing word. So the word itself, the telos of the word, right? The word, the direction of the spokenness of the word.
Yeah.
Is what he's here referring to as the character of the word. And that's interesting, right? It's the direction of the speech. It's that into which it is that into which the word is spoken.
Yeah.
That is the word's character.
Oh, interesting.
Right?
Interesting.
Right? So there's this adverbial nature then to the spoken word, right? Because it's freeing. It's literally verbalized, right? The word is freeing, and that which makes the word. No, what am I trying to say? It's fundamentally it's the logos of the word, right? It's the structural, functional organization and direction of the word that gives it its character. So I think in a way what's being said here is that what they're seeing behind the word is the logos of its intent, the logos of its function.
Right.
Right? Then that hint would be the word's basic character. The hint, I think, the hint is the glimpse of the logos that emerges when the direction of the word's speech is revealed in the dialogue. That's why that's why dialogos becomes a way of glimpsing logos within word, because dialogos directs speech.
Oh.
Right? And it is the direction of speech, the direction of the word, which is its verbal function,
right,
which reveals its character or its logos.
Yeah. Is it fair to talk about that in terms of the character of the word is, and in some sense, is the possibility that it's addressing, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Fittedness to that possibility is revealed. And so on some level, we can be in that direction, but yet that possibility that it's revealing its direction, its character, hasn't yet been fully disclosed to us.
That's right.
But then it can be. And then we can have that experience of like, oh, we've been inside of this character, this possibility, without knowing it the whole, like, for the last 5 minutes, but then it becomes clear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's exactly it. I think it's a great way of putting it.
Right.
It's like it is, the word has a want that strives, and the striving of the word is its attention, as you say, is its attention to possibility. It adverts itself to possibility and strives. And what's the nature of the striving of the word? Yeah. And that only becomes observable, I think, in when the word is allowed to strive in direction. And it's allowed to strive in direction when it is directed to the comprehension of the listening ear. Right? And so the word takes on some of the valence of the logos and the verbal nature of the logos when spoken into the comprehension of dialogue, which is why there is an implicit dramaturgy. The logos, like the word character. I mean, we talked about this several times, but like, I feel like I'm becoming obsessive about the understanding character as being understanding character as the most proximate way of understanding the logos.
Right. There's that.
And most proximate, because not identical, still analogized, but it seems to,
Right. And I think one of the things of maybe why this is being highlighted in the way that it is it, I think, like the normal understanding of a direction is something that you choose to take. It has this will quality from the subject, right, towards the direction. But this is coming from a very different place. It's saying that no, we're following something, right? In fact, the direction, the character, the word will come after we're already have followed it, right? So it's not a will, right, of a direction, but it's a list. So this is really as much about listening, this dialogue, than it is about saying something, right? This is, on some level, this is like verbally articulating the way one listens to the character of the unfolding happening, right? There's that light touch throughout.
Right.
Of course, I can feel the Japanese spirit in that big time.
Yeah.
So
which is why the way that the dialogue is framed is it allows for that, precisely because he's using the translation of culture as a way of understanding the translation of the logos.
Yeah. Oh man, I don't want this to end ever. And I have my meeting at 7, so.
Oh, that's right. Okay. All right. I'll
awesome.
I'll let you go.
This is very
this was great. And it's been a while, so it's
oh yeah.
Doubly a pleasure for the fact that it's been a little while.
Much love, my friend.
Much love to you. We'll do this soon.